6 weeks ago, I woke up on the floor of my own kitchen in Burnaby, with a split lip, 2 cracked ribs, and my phone smashed to pieces against the tile. The only reason I'm alive is because my neighbor heard the crash through our shared wall and called 911 before I could. Before I tell you what my building full of strangers did for me that night, let me ask you something. Have you ever shared a home with someone and realized too late that the danger was never outside the door? Hit that like button if you believe home is supposed to be where you're safest. Because mine wasn't, not for a long time. I grew up in Kelowna, in the Okanagan Valley, where the summers smell like warm stone and ripe cherries, and the lake turns a color in August that you can't describe to anyone who hasn't seen it. My parents ran a small orchard on the east bench above the city. Nothing fancy. About 12 acres of ambrosia apple trees that my father had planted the year before I was born. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable in the way that people who work outdoors and sleep well tend to be. My mother packed school lunches that smelled like cinnamon, and my father taught me to drive the old tractor when I was 9 years old. He used to say that the land didn't lie to you. That if you put good work in, it would show you exactly what it was worth. That's the kind of man he was. Honest in a way that was so steady it felt like bedrock. I was 16 when his heart gave out during harvest. No warning. He was checking a row of trees at the far end of the lower block, and he just sat down against one of them and didn't get up. The paramedics said he was likely gone before he even felt it. The rest of that autumn is a smear in my memory. The smell of apples going soft in the bins, because we couldn't get the crew organized without him. Neighbors arriving with casseroles. My mother moving through the house at half speed with her eyes somewhere far away. The orchard had debt on it that I hadn't known about. A line of credit my father had taken out during a bad frost year and hadn't quite paid down. My mother didn't have the background to manage it alone. She'd always handled the house and the books, while my father handled the land. And suddenly, the land was too much. By the time I finished high school, she had sold off the lower 8 acres to a neighbor, and we were living on what was left. Tight. Very tight. He showed up the summer I turned 19. My mother had hired a property management firm to help assess what remained of the orchard, and he was the consultant they sent out. His name was Wade. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that fills a room before the person speaking has finished their first sentence. He wore clean work boots and knew the right vocabulary about irrigation and soil chemistry, and my mother, who had been alone and exhausted and frightened for almost 3 years, looked at him like he was a solution. He was attentive in the beginning, brought her wildflowers from the side of the road, helped her renegotiate the line of credit through his contact at a credit union in the city, fixed the broken step on the back porch without being asked. I watched all of it and felt something I couldn't name then, something low in my chest, a wrongness I had no evidence for. He was kind to her in front of me. He called her remarkable. He told her she'd done something extraordinary, keeping the property going, raising her daughter. And she glowed. She actually glowed. They were engaged by December. I was away at UBC by then, studying environmental science on a scholarship and a part-time job at a campus coffee shop. When she called to tell me, I made myself say congratulations. I believed my instincts were just grief. I told myself I was protective of her in a way that was unfair to him. That I needed to try harder. They got married in the spring. Small ceremony at a vineyard outside Kelowna. I was her witness. I stood next to her in a green dress and watched her smile in a way she hadn't smiled since before my father died. For those few hours, I almost convinced myself I'd been wrong about him. I wasn't. The first sign was a comment, not a shout. Sitting at dinner, during a weekend visit, I mentioned that I was thinking of applying to a research position in Victoria. After graduation, Wade set his fork down, leaned back in his chair, and said, very quietly, that it seemed to him a person who couldn't even cover their own tuition without their mother's property, as collateral shouldn't be making plans across the strait. My mother went still. I looked at her. She looked at her plate. That was how it worked. Quiet. Precise. Delivered in a tone that could be mistaken for concern if you weren't paying close attention. By my second year, the calls home felt different. My mother's voice was clipped, like she was speaking with part of her attention pointed behind her. When I asked how things were going, she said fine. When I asked about the orchard, she said Wade was handling it. When I asked what that meant, she changed the subject. Once, I called late on a Tuesday, and she picked up in a whisper, and then hung up after 40 seconds. She texted me 5 minutes later. Sorry, he was sleeping. He wasn't sleeping. She was afraid of waking him. I came home for a long weekend in October of my third year and found 3 things that I couldn't unfind. The first was that the 2 remaining acres of the upper orchard, the block my father had planted first, the one he'd been proudest of, had been sold. My mother told me it had been necessary. She said it without meeting my eyes. The second was a bruise on her left forearm, yellow-green and fading, which she covered with her sleeve when she caught me looking. The third was the way she angled her body when Wade walked through a room, always slightly turned, always ready to adjust. It was not the posture of someone who felt safe. It was the posture of someone who had learned to take up less space. I confronted her in the kitchen while he was out picking up groceries. I kept my voice low and steady. I asked about the bruise. She said she'd caught it on the corner of a cabinet. I asked which cabinet. She couldn't say. I took her hand very carefully and told her I needed her to tell me the truth. She pulled away. She said I was making something out of nothing, that I didn't understand their relationship, that Wade was going through a difficult time, and I had no idea what it took to support a partner. She said, I had always been like this, that I saw problems where there weren't any, that my father would have wanted her to be happy. That one hit somewhere deeps. I think it was meant to. I drove back to Vancouver on the Sunday night and cried the whole way down the Coquihalla in the dark, not because she had said something cruel, because she had said it like she believed it. Whatever he'd been telling her for 2 years, she had absorbed it completely. He hadn't just built walls around her. He had convinced her the walls were her own idea. I finished my degree. I moved to Vancouver properly, found a basement suite in Burnaby near the SkyTrain, started working for a small environmental consulting firm in New Westminster. I built something that looked like a life. But the calls home never got better. They got shorter, and the gaps between them got longer, because each one left me sitting on my kitchen floor afterward, with a knot in my chest that took days to loosen. That winter, my mother sent me a Christmas card, a photo of the 2 of them in front of a small tree. She was smiling the way people smile in photos when someone has asked them to. And there, just above the collar of her turtleneck sweater, was something she hadn't fully covered. A thin red mark. Horizontal. New. I called my aunt in Penticton, my father's sister, who had never trusted Wade from the beginning. She told me she'd been trying to visit for months and kept being told it wasn't a good time. She said the last time she'd spoken to my mother had apologized twice during the conversation, unprompted, for things that didn't require apology. My aunt used the word controlled, and I didn't argue with her. I called my mother and said I was coming for New Year's. There was a long pause. She said that might be tricky. I said I wasn't asking. The visit was 4 days of performance. Wade played the generous host. He poured wine, made elaborate dinners, asked about my work with a pretend interest that was almost convincing, but he never left us alone. Not once. If I followed my mother to the kitchen, he materialized in the doorway. If we sat on the back porch, he found a reason to come outside. He was a man who managed proximity like a resource. On the 3rd day, I got 20 minutes with her while he was shoveling the driveway. I took both her hands. I told her I had done research. I told her there was a program through the BC Society for Transition Houses, that there were resources specifically for women in rural and semi-rural situations, that she could call a line anonymously. I slid a piece of paper into her coat pocket. She looked at it like she didn't know what it was. She put it back in my hand and told me to please stop, that she'd handle things, that I was making her life harder by doing this. On my last morning, before I could get to the door with my bag, Wade blocked the hallway. He didn't raise his voice. He put one hand against the wall beside my head and spoke quietly, pleasantly, like we were discussing the weather. He said he'd been very patient with my visits, that he understood I had concerns, but that concerns without evidence were just interference. He said my mother was content, that she had everything she needed, and that if I kept inserting myself into their life, he would make sure my mother understood exactly how much stress I was causing her. I drove back to Burnaby with both hands gripping the wheel and the heat on full, even though I wasn't cold. For 6 weeks after that, I tried to do everything through channels. I called the non-emergency RCT line and was told that without a complaint from my mother, there wasn't much they could do for a welfare check situation. I called a victim services worker, who was kind and thorough and, ultimately, said the same thing in different words. I talked to a family lawyer I found through the Law Society of BC Referral Service, who told me that adult family members had the right to make their own choices, and that without my mother's consent or a report of specific imminent harm, the legal avenues were limited. I was sitting at my desk at work one afternoon, staring at a drainage report I hadn't read a word of when my phone rang. It was a Kelowna number I didn't recognize. It was my mother. She was at a gas station 2 blocks from the house. She had walked there in her parka with no bag and no wallet. Her voice was shaking so badly. I had to ask her to slow down. She said he had thrown her against the bathroom vanity that morning. She said she'd needed to hold herself up by the counter and look in the mirror to remember what her own face looked like. And then she said 4 words I had waited years to hear. She said, "I want to leave." I told her to stay exactly where she was. I called my aunt, who was 2 hours away, and started driving immediately. I called the RCMP non-emergency number and explained that my mother had left the property on foot and was asking for help. The constable I reached was a woman with a practical, unhurried voice who took the address, took my mother's name, and told me to keep my mother on the line. The RCMP arrived at the gas station before my aunt did. 2 officers. My mother was sitting on a plastic chair inside by the register and the cashier. A young guy, who couldn't have been more than 20, had given her a cup of coffee and stayed nearby without making it obvious. When I talked to my mother on the phone while she waited, she told me about that coffee. She said it was the first thing someone had given her, without expecting something back in a long time. Wade came looking for her. He pulled up in his truck 40 minutes after she'd left and walked into the gas station, like he had every right to. The officers were still there. He saw them and pivoted to a performance of bewildered concern. The worried husband. Where did she go? He'd been looking everywhere. One of the officers asked him to stay outside. He didn't perform well when he couldn't control the room. They photographed the bruising on my mother's back and arms. There were 5 separate areas of bruising documented that afternoon. The RCMP opened a file. Victim Services was contacted. My aunt arrived, and my mother walked out to her car and got in, and Wade stood in the parking lot watching, and there was nothing he could do. My aunt drove her to Penticton. My mother slept for 11 hours that first night. I drove up the following weekend. When I walked into my aunt's guest room, my mother was sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of tea. She looked smaller than I remembered. She looked tired in a way that was older than fatigue, but when she saw me, she reached out and took my hand before I'd even sat down. She said, "I'm sorry it took so long." I said, "I know, we didn't need more than that." The process that followed was not fast and it was not clean. There were RCMP statements and a Crown Counsel review, and a process that moved at the pace bureaucracies move, which is to say, maddening. My mother stayed in Penticton with my aunt and began seeing a counselor through Interior Health. Wade retained a lawyer, and initially contested everything. What he had not anticipated was documentation. My aunt had kept every unanswered call. I had kept every text. The victim services worker had files. The RCMP had the photographs. His lawyer, when presented with the weight of what had been assembled, advised him that his position was not strong. He pled guilty to 2 counts of assault causing bodily harm. He received a conditional sentence, a no-contact order, and a condition barring him from the Kelowna property. The property. That was its own battle. The land that remained had been partly transferred into Wade's name through an arrangement he'd convinced my mother to sign during the first year of the marriage. We had a family lawyer go through it carefully. Parts of what he'd done could be challenged. We challenged them. It took 8 months and a formal mediation process and money we didn't comfortably have. But in the end, my mother walked away with the house and the last 2 acres, the ones nearest the road, and enough of a settlement to start again without the debt he'd accumulated in her name during the marriage. My father's upper block was gone. That one I still grieve. Sometimes I think about those trees, his first planting, and it feels like something taken that can't be given back, the same way you can't unlose certain years. But I have learned that grief and forward motion can exist at the same time. You don't have to be finished mourning something to keep going. My mother moved back to the Kelowna property in the spring. I helped her paint the bedroom a different color. We pulled out the furniture he'd chosen and replaced what we could afford to replace, and left the rest sparse, which suited her fine. She said the empty spaces felt like room to breathe. She started volunteering 2 mornings a week with a local organization that supports women leaving abusive relationships. She does intake calls, mostly because she has a voice that makes frightened people feel less frightened. She told me once, matter-of-factly, that she knows exactly which silences on the phone mean a woman is trying not to be heard. I know which silences she means. I heard them for 4 years on the other end of the line from Vancouver. I still live in Burnaby. I still take the SkyTrain to New Westminster and do work that tries to repair small pieces of the natural world. But I drive up to Kelowna about once a month now. We sit on the back porch my father built and drink whatever's in season and watch the light change over the valley. And my mother tells me about the women she's helped that week. And I tell her about the projects I'm working on, and we have found our way back to each other through something that tried hard to keep us apart. What happened to me and my mother is not a story about exceptional evil. Wade was not a monster from a movie. He was an ordinary man who understood how to find someone in a moment of vulnerability, how to make himself indispensable, and how to tighten his grip slowly up that she didn't feel it until she couldn't breathe. That's the version that doesn't make the news. That's the version that happens in houses on quiet streets, in cities across this country, right now, while you're listening. If you hear something in this story that sounds familiar, you are not imagining it. The distress line for BC is available around the clock. If you're outside BC, every province has one. You don't have to have a bruise to call. You don't have to be certain. You just have to feel like something is wrong. Because something probably is. My mother is the bravest person I know. Not because of what she endured, because of the morning she walked out of that house in her parka with no bag and no wallet and said, out loud, to herself, and then to me, enough. She decided that her life was still hers. And it was.